Now, moving on to the DHL Supply Chain Pricing Power Index update, I'm here with Andrew Cox. Andrew, what's the latest?
Anthony, the pricing power index stayed at 70 this week. We were at 70 last week. We're staying there this week. The main points of emphasis are here that, as Zach mentioned, rejections are sliding. They seemingly have found a slight support here at about 22%. They've slid down from that holiday level of nearly 30. But I want to say that movement downward is not because a material capacity has been added. Rather, contract rates are being rebid up through this rebidding season, making carriers less in need to reject freight. We saw that in the Ontario market. Zach just mentioned it. Rejection rates are down to 14%, but volumes are still pushing up. So we could see some more pressure there. On the volume side, they remain fairly strong, very strong. We have, on a rejection adjusted basis, OTVI is up about 20% year over year. There's really no let up in sight. If you look at the West Coast, it is absolutely loaded up with freight for weeks, possibly even months. Every anchorage and port space in the San Pedro Bay is now filled up with ships. And we're going to talk a little bit about the stimulus checks and its immediate impact on spending here in a moment as well.
So, Andrew, just one of those things that you're really just kind of tying it all together. We're seeing some volume still steadily increasing. As you mentioned, ports are still very full. Are you thinking a lot of this is going to be on the consumer side?
Well, it's easy to point that way, and we'll get into some of the data as to why here in 1 second. So we'll take a look at volumes, as I said. So on a rejection basis, which is just taking the outbound tender volume index and multiplying it by the inverse of the outbound tender rejection index. So in theory, the outbound tender acceptance index. And so when you do that and you account for the excess rejections of tenders in our outbound tender volume index, you still have OTVI up roughly 20% year over year. So volumes are very strong on a historical basis, and the West Coast will continue to be a feeder for that freight. And a lot of that is retail consumer freight. And let me show you a little bit of the spending data from Bank of America here. So this is total card spending, and they aggregated it by groups that did receive the stimulus check and by households that did not receive the stimulus check. So there was an immediate impact from the stimulus. Total card spending was up about 20% for the stimulus recipients since January 1st. And when indexed, so you indexed both groups, total card spending for the stimulus recipients is up about 30% over the first 5 days of the year. So those first stimulus checks began going out on January 1st. We saw an immediate impact to spending there. And the lowest income brackets are the ones having the most impact from these stimulus benefits. The lowest income tier total card spending was up a stellar 22% year over year in the latest week of data up to January 9th. And this is just evidence that the consumer is managing. Although, given the backdrop, of economic the economic backdrop, we have unemployment rising again. We lost 140,000 jobs last week. That being said, the data is pretty good. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the stimulus money is being spent on, what areas of freight is being moved the most. So in total, the total card spending accelerated this week, up from 2.2% year over year last week to 2.5% year over year this week. I think a lot of that had some stimulus boost to it. That first stimulus, if we look here at this chart, so we've got the 2021 stimulus in blue and the 2020 stimulus back from April in yellow. So the first stimulus was disproportionately spent on online electronics. And I do believe there's been some saturation in the electronics demand. That's why we see not so much of an outsized demand for online electronics with this new benefit. The new stimulus is really being spent on clothing. And I think this indicates a bigger trend in 2021 is a reignition of the apparel industry. We saw apparel was down something like 25% in 2020. People had no need to buy clothes because they were staying at home. But I do think that's a big point. And overall here is that goods demand is holding up pretty well given the economic backdrop. Like I said, we lost 140,000 jobs last week. And truly one of the big variables here is the slow vaccine rollout. It is keeping a lid on what I think is going to be a generational release of pent-up demand for services. The slow rollout is probably kind of a net neutral for freight as a whole. It's keeping a lid on service demand and inducing demand for goods.
Got it. And Andrew, as you mentioned, we had a stimulus package that was released a little bit later on in the latter half of the year going into 2021. Do you think further stimulus would really add a significant boost moving forward?
Well, if we just look at what this latest stimulus did and what the first stimulus did, it had immediate impacts to spending. And this next proposed stimulus is proposed to be even bigger than the previous two. So yes, I do think that you'll see a pretty immediate impact to spending. Obviously, the government can't perfectly translate all $1,400 that they may give to us into $1,400 of spending. Some of that will go to pay down debt or to buy other things, but the good thing is that a lot of it and a good portion of it is seeing benefits in spending almost immediately after it's released. So on Midday Market Update yesterday, we discussed Greg Miller's article on the California container ship jam. And I made this chart just the other day, and it's comparing the Global Port Tracker, which is the retail import data from Hackett Associates, as well as the National Retail Federation, and then comparing that to retail sales from the Commerce Department. So you can see, a pretty wide range here. In the first half of the year, sales and imports were way down. The back half of the year, sales and imports were way up. But if you take the whole year as a whole, you still only have retail imports up 1.5% year over year, while retail sales are up. We're up 4.1% in November. So the Port of LA is expecting continued demand for imports through the first few months of the year. They're expecting continual growth in imports over the next few weeks, especially. And I do believe there's still just major restocking ahead. We have, as I said, demand is staying pretty strong given the economic backdrop, and there's still a lot of restocking to do. The total business inventories are still at its lowest point in 5 years. So I think even if demand were to slow a little bit, we have this inventory restocking thesis that should keep volumes pumping through the country.
So Andrew, it sounds like a lot of backlog really going to keep things moving forward, even if demand starts to wane.
That's what it seems. I mean, and we also have this blooming industrial recovery happening as well. PMI is at its highest point in 2.5 years. We have industrial production picking up. Again, that should be, pushed especially by the auto market. They're expecting auto production to be up 20% year over year in 2021. It's over easy comps. Yes, 2020 was a slow year for production, but it's a good boost. We also have Boeing and the aerospace sector that should get back online with the 737. So there's an industrial growth that should occur. And I've got one last slide just to take a look at for capacity. So this is just take one last look at the pricing power. So I talked about some of those drivers of demand and how I think freight flows are going to continue being strong. Let's talk a little bit about capacity for a moment. So this is just our outbound tender rejection index in blue, and then the truck stop van rate per mile spot rate in orange. I mean, it's just been extremely strong in the back half of the year in the last 6 months. I do expect to see this tender rejection rate continue to fall down a little bit. I don't expect us to get anywhere near the beginning of last year or even the end of 2019. But I think that we're going to see rejection rates come down as bid season progresses, as carriers bid up those contract rates closer to spot rates. We probably see some downward pressure on spot rates and some downward pressure on rejection rates. But that doesn't mean that the environment is loosening. Rather, it's still a tight environment, but carriers are being rewarded and are being paid a higher price for their tight capacity. So carriers are still in a really good position. The DHL supply chain pricing power index stays at 70 this week, poised to go higher in the coming weeks.
So just that, Andrew, speaking of expectations, you expect the DHL PPI to move upward in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I definitely expect it to not go down. I expect carriers to stay pretty strong. We have a lot of capacity that should be added to the market, or rather a lot of equipment that should be added to the market in the middle of the year and towards the back end of the year. But we still have a lot of bottlenecks on the driver side. We're seeing that with rising wages and wage inflation. So even if they get all that equipment, it still is going to be pretty difficult to get people in the truck. So I do expect capacity to stay fairly tight and contract rates to go up. And I expect the pricing power to stay in the hands of the carriers. I think our 3-month outlook is at 75 right now. So imagine that, that's a lot of that is going to be dependent on the vaccine rollout. How many million Americans are vaccinated by that point? President Biden has set a goal for 100 million in the first 100 days. I'm skeptical given the slow vaccine rollout so far, but if they can really get that many, then we should see a lot of spending being shifted back towards services and people feeling free to go out and spend money on services.
Skepticism definitely well-deserved. Andrew, this is insightful. As always, where can people find more information?
So you can go to FreightWaves/communities to sign up for any of our retail supply chain or CPG or automotive newsletters that we write. I write the point of sale, which is for the retail community. You can always go to FreightWaves.com/passport for all of the research from the Passport team. Seth Holm, Hunter Carroll, and Tony Mulvey are pumping out good stuff every week.